Racist cop illegally searches black man's Rolls-Royce Cullinan. Unaware he's the new mayor. What Officer Brad Nolan thought would be a routine intimidation stop on a quiet Riverton Heights street would instead become the moment his entire career collapsed. All because he never imagined the calm black man behind the wheel of a $400,000 Rolls-Royce Cullinan was the city's newly elected mayor, quietly testing whether the law applied equally to everyone. The morning began like dozens of others had since Caleb Wright took office, with the new mayor choosing not to announce himself, not to travel with a driver, and not to surround himself with aides or police escorts, because he wanted to see the city the way its residents did, not from behind tinted glass or stage press events, but from the driver's seat of his own vehicle, moving through neighborhoods that had generated years of complaints about unlawful stops and racial profiling, complaints that had been logged, reviewed, and quietly dismissed long before voters decided change was overdue. Wright had spent weeks studying internal reports, body cam audits, and civil rights summaries before his election, and one pattern appeared again and again. Black drivers in high-value vehicles were being stopped without citations, questioned about ownership, and searched without consent, yet discipline rarely followed. So on this particular Tuesday morning, dressed in a simple blazer and slacks, Wright eased his black Rolls-Royce Cullinan out of his garage and headed toward District 4, an area repeatedly flagged in those same reports, driving precisely at the speed limit, signaling every turn, stopping fully at each intersection, deliberately giving no officer a legitimate reason to intervene, because the point was not to provoke a violation but to observe whether assumptions alone would be enough. 10 minutes into the drive, a patrol car eased into his rearview mirror, lingering just far enough back to watch, then falling in line again, and Wright felt a familiar calm settle in. Not fear, not anger, but a focused awareness, because this was exactly what he had been waiting for. And when the red and blue lights finally activated, he pulled over immediately, placed the vehicle in park, and rested both hands on the steering wheel in clear view, while Officer Brad Nolan, a 6-year veteran with a reputation for proactive policing that supervisors praised and residents quietly feared, stepped out of his cruiser already convinced he knew how this encounter would go. Nolan approached with his hand hovering near his belt, not offering a greeting, not explaining the stop, but instead stopping at the window and saying, "License and registration, and don't make this difficult," a tone that carried authority without justification. And Wright, calm and measured, asked the same question every citizen was entitled to ask. "Officer, can you tell me why I've been pulled over?" Only for Nolan to ignore it completely, repeating his demand and adding, "And I'll need proof this car is yours," a request that had no legal basis but plenty of history behind it. As Wright slowly retrieved his documents, handed them over, and again asked for the reason for the stop, Nolan scanned the paperwork, noting the name but not recognizing it, his attention clearly more fixed on the vehicle than the man, and said, "You know how many stolen luxury cars we see around here?" Implying guilt without accusation, while Wright replied evenly, "Driving an expensive car isn't a crime, and I haven't violated any traffic laws," a statement that visibly irritated Nolan, who interpreted calm confidence as defiance, and in response ordered, "Step out of the vehicle," to which Wright replied, just as calmly, "I don't consent to exiting my vehicle unless you can articulate a lawful reason for this stop." And in that moment, the interaction shifted from suspicion to confrontation, because Nolan wasn't accustomed to being questioned, especially not by someone he had already categorized as suspicious, and his voice sharpened as he said, "If you don't step out right now, you're going to be detained," a threat unsupported by cause but delivered with certainty, while Wright looked straight ahead, aware that every word was being recorded, aware that this single exchange mirrored dozens he had read in complaint files, and aware that how he responded would determine not just the outcome of this stop, but the credibility of everything he intended to change. So he said clearly, "For the record, I am not resisting, but I am asserting my Fourth Amendment rights, and I do not consent to any search," then slowly opened the door and stepped out under protest, hands visible, posture relaxed, as Nolan positioned him beside the Cullinan and began a pat-down that yielded nothing, yet still failed to satisfy the officer's assumption that something must be wrong, because the problem had never been evidence, it had been expectation. And as Nolan circled the vehicle, Glancing inside, Wright could see the decision forming before it was spoken, the same decision that had played out countless times for other men who didn't have the authority or platform he did. And when Nolan said, "I'm going to check the vehicle," Wright responded firmly, "I do not consent to any search, and you have no probable cause." But the words didn't slow Nolan at all, because in his mind, refusal itself had become justification, and as he reached for the door handle, convinced he was about to confirm what he already believed, neither man yet acknowledged the truth that would soon make this stop impossible to explain, impossible to justify, and impossible to undo. Officer Brad Nolan had already decided how the story would end long before he opened the first door of the Rolls-Royce Cullinan, because in his mind suspicion wasn't built on evidence, it was built on assumption, and as Mayor Caleb Wright stood beside his own vehicle with his hands calmly visible, repeating clearly for the body camera, "I do not consent to any searches," Nolan brushed past the words as if they carried no legal weight at all, pulling open the driver's door and leaning inside to scan the dashboard, the center console, the cup holders, as though contraband might magically appear to validate the stop. But there was nothing. No drugs, no weapons, no cash bundles, no nervous movements. Just a pristine interior and the quiet hum of a luxury engine cooling in the morning air. Nolan moved methodically, though not carefully, opening the glove compartment, rifling through registration papers he had already examined, glancing under the seats, narrating into his body cam vague phrases like possible indicators without identifying a single concrete fact, while Wright remained composed, aware that every second the search continued without probable cause deepened the violation. And when Nolan stepped back and said, "Pop the truck," Wright replied, "You may open it yourself, but I am not granting permission," making sure the distinction was unmistakable, because consent changes legality, and he was determined not to blur that line. Nolan walked to the rear of the Cullinan, pressed the trunk release, and lifted it slowly, as if expecting something dramatic inside. Yet what he saw instead was a neatly arranged cargo space containing a leather briefcase embossed with the official seal of the city of Riverton Heights, a garment bag, and nothing more. And for a brief second Nolan hesitated, not because he questioned his authority, but because the seal gave him pause, before brushing it off and grabbing the briefcase anyway, telling himself that criminals often hide behind appearances, that symbols and titles mean nothing if wrongdoing is present, and that he was simply being thorough. He placed the briefcase on the edge of the trunk and snapped it open, ignoring the fact that searching a closed container without a warrant, consent, or exigent circumstances crossed yet another constitutional boundary. And inside he found organized documents, folders, and a thin black portfolio stamped again with the city seal. And as he pulled the first sheet from the portfolio, his expression shifted, the confidence draining almost instantly as he read the bold heading at the top, City of Riverton Heights, Office of the Mayor, followed by a second line that felt heavier with each word, Official Personnel Action, and beneath it, in clear type, Officer Bradley Nolan, badge number 3186, his own name staring back at him like a mirror he wasn't prepared to face. His eyes moved down the page slowly, absorbing phrases that felt unreal. Unlawful stop, lack of reasonable suspicion, illegal search conducted after refusal of consent, pattern of racially disparate enforcement, and finally, termination effective immediately pending administrative review. And at the bottom, the signature that confirmed what his mind was still resisting. Caleb Wright, Mayor, City of Riverton Heights. And Nolan looked up from the paper as if expecting someone else to explain it, his face paling, his grip on the document tightening slightly, and for the first time since activating his lights, he seemed unsure of his footing. Wright met his gaze steadily, not angry, not triumphant, but resolute, and Nolan's voice, which minutes earlier had carried sharp authority, now faltered into a strained whisper. "You're the mayor?" And Wright answered simply, "Yes," letting the words settle between them, because there was no need for elaboration. The evidence lay in Nolan's own hands and in the camera recording every second. Nolan's mind raced backward through the interaction, replaying each demand, each threat, each ignored question, and the realization struck him not gradually, but all at once, that every decision he had justified internally as instinct or caution had now been documented as bias and overreach, and he tried to recover, saying, "I didn't know who you were," as though identity altered legality, but Wright replied calmly, "You shouldn't have needed to," emphasizing the point that constitutional protections do not depend on status, title, or recognition. Nolan's breathing grew uneven as he glanced toward his patrol car, toward the quiet street that moments ago had felt routine, and back at the termination notice that spelled out consequences in precise language. And for the first time, he seemed aware that this stop was never about a traffic infraction, that it had been a test of judgment, discretion, and respect for rights, and that he had failed each measure publicly and permanently. Wright stepped closer, not aggressively, but firmly, and said, "Everything you've done here is recorded on your body camera and mine," revealing his phone, which had been capturing audio since the initial approach, and Nolan's shoulders dropped slightly at the confirmation that there would be no dispute about tone, wording, or sequence, because the footage would speak for itself. And when Wright added, "A supervisor is already on the way," Nolan felt the final thread of control slip from his grasp, the authority he had assumed minutes earlier dissolving into the reality that he was now the subject of the very accountability he had dismissed in others, standing beside a luxury SUV he believed didn't belong in the neighborhood, holding a document that proved he no longer belonged in his uniform if the city upheld what he had just read. By the time the second patrol unit arrived, the dynamic on the quiet Riverton Heights street had completely reversed, because Officer Brad Nolan was no longer the one issuing commands. He was the one standing rigid and silent beside his cruiser, while Mayor Caleb Wright calmly briefed Sergeant Elena Morales on exactly what had occurred. And Morales didn't need a dramatic explanation, because the body camera footage, still recording, had already preserved every demand for proof of ownership, every refusal to articulate reasonable suspicion, every threat of arrest without lawful basis, and the unmistakable moment Nolan opened a closed briefcase after being explicitly denied consent. Wright's voice remained steady as he summarized the timeline, emphasizing that he had obeyed all traffic laws, asked repeatedly for the reason for the stop, and stated clearly, multiple times, that he did not consent to a search. And Morales, a 15-year veteran who understood the weight of constitutional violations, turned to Nolan and asked the question that mattered most. "Did you observe a traffic violation or specific criminal indicator before initiating this stop?" And Nolan hesitated, glancing down at the pavement before offering the same justification that had guided his decision from the beginning. The vehicle looked out of place in that area, a statement that hung in the air like an admission rather than a defense, because "out of place" was not written anywhere in the legal standard. For reasonable suspicion, Morales closed her notebook slowly, then requested Nolan's badge and service weapon pending administrative review, and the act of unclipping the badge, an emblem that once symbolized authority, felt heavier than Nolan expected, because in that instant the power he had exercised minutes earlier evaporated into procedure, policy, and consequence. Wright watched without expression as the exchange unfolded, not celebrating, not humiliating, but ensuring the process moved forward. And when Morales informed Nolan that he was relieved of duty effective immediately, escorted back to headquarters for formal questioning, and placed on suspension pending investigation, the finality of it seemed to settle into his posture, shoulders slumping slightly, as if the realization had finally caught up to him. Within hours, Wright convened an emergency meeting at City Hall, where department command staff, legal counsel, and members of the Independent Civilian Oversight Board reviewed the footage frame by frame, pausing at critical moments. The initial demand for ownership proof without cause, the escalation when Wright asserted his rights, the explicit refusal of consent before the trunk search, and the unmistakable discovery of the termination notice that confirmed Nolan had been testing not a suspect, but the limits of his own judgment. And there was no ambiguity in what the video revealed, no hidden context to soften the sequence, because the camera documented a straightforward narrative. Assumption led to action, action ignored law, and law required response. The following morning, Mayor Wright stood at a podium inside the municipal press room, with the city seal behind him, speaking not with outrage but with clarity, explaining that the stop was part of a broader initiative to evaluate enforcement practices in neighborhoods historically burdened by disproportionate traffic stops. And he addressed the central issue directly: driving an expensive vehicle is not probable cause, and the Constitution does not fluctuate based on the driver's race or profession. Before confirming that Officer Nolan's termination had been finalized after review of his prior complaints, which revealed a consistent pattern of stops involving minority drivers in high-value vehicles that had previously resulted in warnings but no corrective action. Reporters asked whether the mayor believed he had set a trap, and Wright responded evenly: "No trap was necessary. The only requirement was that the law be followed," underscoring that a lawful stop supported by articulable facts would have resulted in nothing more than a brief exchange and mutual respect, but an unlawful one exposed deeper issues. In the weeks that followed, Riverton Heights implemented sweeping reforms, including mandatory documentation of reasonable suspicion in every traffic stop report, quarterly audits of body camera footage by an external oversight panel, expanded constitutional policing training, and a data transparency portal allowing residents to view anonymized stop statistics by district, race, and outcome. And the effect was measurable. Complaints declined, citation patterns became more consistent, and community forums once dominated by frustration began to include cautious optimism. As for Nolan, arbitration upheld determination after independent review determined the stop lacked legal foundation and the search violated established policy. And while he sought employment in neighboring jurisdictions, background checks referencing constitutional violations and recorded misconduct limited his options, eventually leading him into private security work far removed from public authority. Mayor Wright, meanwhile, continued driving his Rolls-Royce Cullinan through every district of the city without incident, not as a symbol of status, but as a reminder that ownership is not suspicion, and authority must answer to the same laws it enforces. And 5 years later, Riverton Heights would be cited in statewide reports as an example of measurable reform driven not by speeches alone, but by a single recorded encounter that forced accountability into the open, proving that the most powerful message was not delivered in anger or spectacle, but in the quiet, documented insistence that constitutional rights belong to everyone, especially when no one thinks they do.